IPEN Global meeting, and I'm delighted with the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about a project that IPEN and National Toxics Network here in Australia are working on to do with aquatic pollutants, oceans and fisheries. Some of you would already seen the IPEN Oceans Pollutant Guide from 2018. So if you're working on toxics or oceans or fisheries, lots of information in there, lots of useful things you can use in your lobbying. But this latest report, which is at last draft stage, is focusing more on the fisheries angle. And the team is led by Dr. Matt Landos, who is Australia's leading fisheries vet, myself, and Jo Emig, who's the National Toxics Network coordinator and an environmental scientist in herself. For those who don't know Matt, that's a photo of him doing his favourite thing, and that is fishing with his son. And while he does that, he contemplates the big question: where did all the fish go? You know, did we catch too many? Have we taken away their food sources? Have we made them less fertile? And the answer really is all of the above. But before I talk about pollutants, I really want to put this in the overarching framework of climate change, because the context of climate change is so important to aquatic ecosystems. It is devastating both marine and freshwater ecosystems. We're seeing increased drought and flooding and extreme events like the fires we've had in Australia. And you may wonder, what have fires got to do with water quality? Think about the phenomenal runoff from the fires with all the contaminants, but also the millions and millions of litres of fire retardant, many of which we know to be aquatic toxins. The oceans are rapidly heating, 4.5 times faster in the last 30 years than in the previous. The oceans are more acidic. They're 26% more acidic than they were before the Industrial Revolution. And that impacts everything from diatoms, which are sort of the basis of the food chain, through to mollusks, crabs, even the ability of fish to spawn. And we've seen, even in commercial oyster growers, a reduced larval survival. Salinity levels are going up, oxygen levels are going down. That's leading to many dead zones where you have fish die off. And that combined with the nutrients is pushing more increased freshwater and marine algal blooms. But most importantly for chemicals, climate change is increasing the mobilisation of historic chemicals, things like the old POPs, DDT and PCBs. And it's removing them from the environmental sinks like ice and snow and residue and sediment. Climate change is also having a phenomenal effect on the actual life cycle of a chemical. Everything from its degradation through to its bioavailability and bioaccumulation. And in response, chemicals, for example, pesticides, are affecting the ability of fish to cope with heating up of their water. Matt once described the oceans to me as a giant global sump, collecting our rubbish and chemicals. And when you look at some of these photos, you really understand that. 80% of water pollution originates on land, whether it be plastic or chemicals. And that's from everything from industrial releases, coal combustion, effluent runoff, mining wastes, and of course, agricultural pesticides. It gets into the waterways via atmospheric transport, runoff into the waterways, or direct disposal, dumping and spills. And one of the things that is of major concern that we talk about in our report is the sea surface microlayer. This is the top tiny bit of the ocean, the very shallow bit at the top, and it is a critical habitat for fish eggs and larvae of all species, but including commercial fisheries. It's also a habitat of phytoplankton, which is the food for so many fisheries. Yet we know that over 80% of surface seawater is now contaminated with the PFAS forever chemicals, the chemicals that simply don't break down and continue to do their harm forever. And just one thing I will mention here is the new threat of deep sea mining. The photo you can see there of that piece of machinery, we are told that that machine can move across the ocean floor without causing environmental devastation. That's something I simply cannot believe. So what are the pollutants that we're talking about? Well, one thing we know for sure is that there's far, far more than ever before. And we talk about the POPs chemicals like PCBs and DDTs that we've been finding in marine and aquatic environments right since the 60s. But they're now being joined by the brominated and the fluorinated chemicals, the PBDEs and the PFAS, and a whole range of heavy metal, mercury, TBT, I think many of you have heard about, oil and polyaromatic hydrocarbons. Then there's this great group of nonylphenyl surfactants or detergents. Industry uses extensive amounts of these, and what's worrying about these are that they are endocrine disruptors. Of course, we have pesticides, nutrients. Pharmaceuticals are another major class. I must admit, I was quite shocked when I read about the detection of antidepressants in something like the Baltic Sea, where they estimate 55 tons of antidepressants are present in that small sea. And of course, there's the birth control pill and a range of other personal care products and industrial and agricultural emissions. I won't talk much about microplastics because I know that will have been discussed in previous presentations by now. But just to say that those chemical additives, the BPAs, the phthalates, they're released by weathering. We've seen degradation products from plastic. And most worrying is the fact that microplastics attract and then concentrate POPs and other persistent bioaccumulative toxins. And we know that they move into the marine species. For example, in green turtles, PCBs are positively correlated with the amount of plastic they ingest. And so I think the message that comes very clearly from this is that the oceans of the world, the freshwater rivers and creeks and lakes of the world are awash with endocrine disrupting chemicals. So we know that pollutants have catastrophic direct effects, but they also have a range of very nasty indirect effects. The direct effects can be broken up into pretty much three groups: reproductive impacts like reduced fertility, the feminization of male fish, which we see over and over again downstream of wastewater effluent releases, intersex, something that's been, as I say, associated with TBT and impaired growth and development. But there's also behavioural changes like swimming speed and their defence response and their aggression levels influences how much food they can access. And of course, that influences survivability. And then there's the immune responses. Many of the pollutants are immunotoxins, and this affects the way fish cope with their parasites and other diseases, and in marine mammals is linked to the development of quite nasty cancers. We saw lots of evidence of synergistic impacts of mixtures. We saw lots of evidence that the sequence and timing of exposure affected their toxicity, and transgenerational impacts, which was of incredible concern. Bioaccumulation and biomagnification, we know that's happening, and unfortunately we're at the top of the food chain, so we're the ones that end up with it all. But the indirect effects are just as important, and for example, insecticides wreck the aquatic food chain by killing off the insects and larvae that live in the sediment, and they're the food source for many others. Herbicides, they damage corals, symbiotic algae, they're associated with mangrove dieback, and of course the synthetic estrogens are known to decimate small fish populations in enclosed bodies of water. And again, those small fish are the food source for larger fish and larger species. And in 2018, the US Geological Survey warned of the ruinous impacts of EDCs on fish populations. And I do hope you like the little cartoon up there. It's quite amusing, but so ever so true. So what have we learned? Well, we've certainly learned that business as usual is not an option. disproportionately affected are those people who rely solely or highly on fish for their protein. Indigenous and Arctic people, island communities, subsistent fishers. Yes, we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals for oceans and water, and we have a myriad of national, regional and global programs and instruments, but the problem is getting worse. It's not getting better. And we would suggest that unless you deal with 4 major aspects, nothing is going to get better in the future. And that is, firstly, the reliance on fossil fuels. That's driving acidification, driving heating of the oceans and waterways. That needs to be addressed. We need to reduce our dependence on industrial farming and pesticides. And our increasing population is driving unsustainable consumerism, resource extraction and waste generation. And when it comes to chemicals, that lack of independent regulatory assessment, monitoring and enforcement of chemicals right through their life cycle, it has to be achieved, because unless we do that, we are not going to move forward. But there are some positive elements. We saw lots of work on regenerative farming, which attempts to sequester carbon, to restore soil health and protect river and ocean health. We saw interesting approaches, ecosystem approaches to aquaculture, where fish farming and seaweed production were done together in a symbiotic process in open waters, which was good for both and reduced any of the nasty contaminants. And of course, there's a range of circular economy initiatives and waste initiatives, which I know many of you are working on. So I'm going to leave it there. I think we've given you enough to think about in your following conversations, but I would just like to leave you on a quote. It is a dark quote, I've got to say, but it really does sum up where we are. So thank you for listening, and I will leave you a minute or so just to read that. And good luck with your meeting in the future now.